Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the Programming Director here at the Osterville Village Library. Thank you for joining us for this very special program presented by my friends from the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Today, we invite you to step back into the age of sail and experience what daily life was like, truly like, aboard the whaling ship Lagoda. From the hard work and dangers at sea to the routines, camaraderie, and resilience of the crews who spent years away from home in pursuit of whale oil during America's whaling era. We are especially fortunate to have with us two knowledgeable and engaging docents from the museum, Nancy Gentile and Capt. Mike Taylor. Through their insights and stories, they will help bring the world of the Lagoda to life and deepen our understanding of New Bedford's rich maritime heritage. Please join me in welcoming Nancy Gentile and Capt. Mike Taylor.
It's always fun to come back here to the library. I'm a retired librarian myself, and I have a feeling that Amy works very, very hard. It's amazing the number of programs you all do here at the library. But I also have a funny story to tell. So yesterday we had an inflatable whale for 100 students. They were each getting a tour of the library. Then they were getting a self-guided tour of the library, and then they were going to be dissecting a squid. And when all of this happened at lunchtime, I mistakenly decided to volunteer to help with getting people young kids into the whale. And I thought I was not going to make it. I got home completely gassed because there were 100 kids very excited. So it happens at libraries all the time. Thank you very much. Okay, so today Mike and I are going to alternate back and forth. We could each talk for probably about an hour on the Lagoda, the captain and the cruise, a whale hunt, processing a whale and so forth. I'm also going to talk a little bit about whaling lives. So we're going to try and give you sort of a bird's eye view and distill it all into 1 hour. And we'd love your questions at the end. Okay, so there. Oh, yeah. So there's a lake in St. Petersburg, Russia. It's called Lake Ladoga. There's a little interesting backstory about Lake Ladoga, which I'll tell you all in a minute. But lots of merchant ships from this country were going there to find iron ingots. We had bog ore in this country, for tools and so forth, but it was soft. It wasn't really great. So they were going for the really good stuff, which was mined along the shores of Lake Ladoga. They were looking for hemp for rigging and cotton duck for sails. We were trading things like tobacco, wood, calico, cotton, sugar, gunpowder, dried fish, of course, and grains. Interestingly, has anyone been to the Whaling Museum and been on the half-scale model? So when I first got there, I thought pagoda, was this a China merchant ship, China trade merchant ship? But no, curators there think it was meant to be called the Ladoga, because in those days you named your ship after where you were going very often. But the sign maker reversed the D and the G by mistake. As Mike will tell you, you had to have white letters on black. That was a rule. He must have just reversed it in his mind. And once there's a sign that's been made for a ship, you don't change it. It's considered bad luck. Sailors wouldn't get on the ship. So we think it was meant to be called the Ladoga for obvious reasons. But all the way back in Duxbury, Mass, we had a shipbuilder whose name was Ezra Weston II. Back in those days, we don't think about it now, but there were loads of shipyards everywhere along many bodies of water in New England. And if you ask any little town what did they do back in the day, they shipbuilt. And so what was then, I think, the North River, we'll talk about this in just a moment here, had something like 25 shipyards along it. It was called Situate then, parts of it are Norwell now. Huge shipbuilding area, and the river really wasn't very deep. So I don't know if you've seen any pictures of British canals where the longboats would be dragged along in the 19th century by a horse on either side to get down the river. They did this there as well. There are stories about it. But if you canoe up the river now, you'll see the site of the Wanton Shipyard, 1670 to 1840. This is where the Lagoda was built. The gentleman I just talked about, Ezra Weston, he had his own shipyard in Duxbury along the Bluefish River, right on his own property. But he commissioned the Lagoda to be built. So the Wanton Shipyard changed hands a bunch of times. But of course, you can see here over 107 vessels were built there, right through the early history. The Lagoda was really anything but typical. Jonathan Bourne owned the Lagoda amongst something like another couple of dozen ships. He had an interest in them. He was born in Monument, which was a little village in Sandwich on the Cape, of course. The reason it's called Bourne now is because when he was a legislator, parts of that town wanted to be their own town. And so he was instrumental in having that happen. So they named Bourne after him. Probably one of the few people in their own lifetimes who got a town named after them before they died. But he went and worked in New Bedford and worked as a grocery store manager in a small grocery store. Within about 3 years, he owned it. And then eventually he married into the Howlands. Talk about in a minute. And his wife was Emily. They had 5 children. And within about 10 years, he was heavily into whaling, no doubt being influenced by the family. He was a wonderful businessman. When a lot of the whale ship owners were getting out of whaling, in the 1850s and so forth, they started investing in the railroads and various other kinds of things. Bourne was still building ships. He just had a certain knack for it. He said, any whale oil is good whale oil. And a lot of the Nantucketers and so forth, a lot of the whale ship owners were going specifically after sperm oil because it made more money. But he combined that with just regular, what we call train oil, which was North Atlantic right whale oil. And there were a lot of North Atlantic right whales off the coast of New England. And so he could go out and make faster trips, come back sooner. Didn't cost him as much. He didn't have to go around the world, although he did send, a lot of ships around the world as well. Took back quite a bit of oil, lots of baleen over its lifetime, and sailed for something like 64 years. Go on here about a little bit about John Howland. There's lots of Howlands in this country, lots of descendants. The original John Howland came over in the Mayflower. He unluckily got thrown off the ship in a bad storm. They reeled him in on a line. And he was a young guy. He was an indentured servant to Governor Carver. And he had 10 children, most of whom survived. And each of his 10 children had 10 children. So there's supposedly something like 10 million descendants. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, Franklin Roosevelt, Dr. Ben Spock, Humphrey Bogart, George Bushes, Sam Irvin of Watergate infamy, Alec Baldwin, Sarah Palin, Chevy Chase.
I could dermatologist.
His dermatologist, and probably somebody here. Just a little bit about the business before I hand this over to Mike. So Quakers popularized a couple of business models that are still in use today. One of them is syndication, right? So instead of 8 or 10 investors losing, or one investor losing an enormous amount of money if the ship is lost or there's a mutiny, etc., between 3 and about 10 investors involve themselves in the firm, so to speak. And this way, you know, if they lost a ship, they could all share the losses as well as whatever profits they were gonna make along the way. Stakes were pretty high, lots of mutinies, bad weather, so forth. The other business model was profit sharing. And it's not really the beneficent form of profit sharing we think about today. It was something called the lay system, which Mike will discuss in detail, but suffice it to say, the guys just had a share in the profit. There's no salary, unlike British whalers who did get salaries. So the owners got about roughly 70%, and the crews got about 30%. And then, of course, the owners were finding all sorts of ways to charge back to the young guys. I was looking at a balance sheet at the end of a book one day, and I thought they got charged for stevedoring because they would bring different folks to come and load the ship and unload it. They were charged for the insurance, but if the owners, you know, lost a lot of money and had to claim insurance, the crews didn't get any of that money. Although we know that in the middle of the 19th century, a lot of young guys who were harpooneers or boat steerers, which are two important jobs on a whale boat, they were starting to invest on themselves and get insurance on their catch, you know, once they started catching whales and storing stuff on board ship. In any case, so they were making very, very little money, really. And the thing to think about whaling, it wasn't really a typical business. So in 1850, to run a farm, it might cost between $2,500 and $3,000 a year, which was a lot of money. You have to kind of multiply it by 30 times to get, you know, today's amounts of money. But to launch a whale ship, especially if you were going to build a ship, was $30,000 to $40,000. It's an enormous amount of money in those days. It's more like a venture capitalist campaign rather than anything else. And so each of these people would throw in about $3,000, which would be about $110,000 in today's money. And I'll talk a little bit about the agents a little bit later. So the markets were lighthouses. We had a bunch of lighthouses in this country. There must have been about 125 around the Great Lakes. So they were selling oil to lighthouses, and they were shipping lots of oil to places like England, France, the Netherlands, and Germany to light their streetlights at night, because the municipalities had just started to ask some of these towns to light their streetlights, and supposedly it decreased the crime, something like 15–20%. There were, you know, lots of other applications, lubrication of machinery, and so. Okay, Mike.
So life aboard a whale ship for the crew was full of danger. And for the owners and his investors, each voyage was a financial risk. So much so that come the midpoint of the whaling industry, about 1840, it no longer made too much sense to cross the bridge from New Bedford across to Fairhaven. And it was a swing bridge in those days, believe it or not, and go to a shipyard and order a new whaling ship just really didn't make any sense. Much better to look for a second-hand cargo ship and convert it. Such was the case of our Lagoda. She was high-sided, broad-beam, and her ample stability would allow for the handling of 60-ton, 60-foot whales alongside. The job of converting her was given to a certain Captain Townsend, who first had the vessel hauled down and her underwater sections exposed. These were careened. Any of the loose copper and more likely Muntz metal plating on the bottom was reattached, and any parts that were missing, having first inspected the hull for ship's work, were replaced. A thick layer of pine was laid the full length of the keel. This would prevent any damage should she ground on some uncharted coral reef during her voyage. Once upright, he built a reservoir, a water reservoir, abaft the foremast. This would form the basis for the try-works, where the oil one day would be processed. It incorporated 2 large cauldrons, holding about 200 to 250 gallons each. Underneath, there was a provision for a fire, which could be fed by doors in the forepart of the try-works. A large tank was placed on the starboard side, where the oil one day would be placed to be cooled before being transferred to casks. A roof was placed over the hull of the try-works in order to prevent any rainwater entering the boiling oil and causing a spill over. The whole of the main weather deck, the top deck, the corked deck, was covered with a sacrificial layer of pine in order to prevent any damage done by the flensing knives when the whales were being processed. The section of the bulwark on the starboard side was cut out and made portable, and a trapeze fitted where one day an officer would stand and flensing the whale. 5 sets of davits were rigged, 3 on the port side, 2 on the starboard. You can always tell a whale ship, if you've got any drawings or paintings at home, if the davits faced outboard, which was to allow the boats to get away quickly, then that is a whaling vessel. Stores were taken on board. The hardware was the most important. They could get fresh provisions of water whenever they stopped in ports. But the hardware, once they left New Bedford, that would have been the last chance. And there were some 800 articles taken aboard that may have to last up to 4 years. Food was taken aboard in dried form. There'd be casks of salted meat, very similar to the meat that you had on St. Patrick's Day, same idea, salted meat. And then water was taken aboard in butts, and there'd be things like flour, ship's biscuit, dried peas, and dried beans. The captain needed to be chosen. He almost certainly was known by the owner. He may in fact have been a relative. But whatever, he was someone that had performed a voyage before which should have been profitable, and perhaps more importantly, brought the owner's vessel back in one piece. The captain was God on board the vessel. Not only was there a navigator who was to take the vessel to the far corners of our earth, but he was the doctor, the dentist, the parson, the lawyer, the business agent. But most of all, of course, he was the trusted arm of our owner, who, as I said, may have not had contact with him for 4 years. It was said that the owner often wrote letters to where he thought the vessel might call it, the stores. The letters were written in quadruplicate and sent to perhaps 4 different places by various vessels that were leaving the port of New Bedford. But I'm told by the United States Post Office, they're still looking for the Lagoda. His accommodation was at the stern of the vessel. His bedrooms on the starboard side, and until my day, all bedrooms for captains were always on the starboard side. There's a small toilet attached to the cabin, which was exclusively for the captain's wife. Since one in five of these vessels, the master's wife accompanied them. His day room had a day bed or a settee, and a large desk or table where he could spread his chart and work out his navigation problem and the ship's business. He had brought aboard his own sextant, and the owner would have supplied him with 2 chronometers, which most likely were rented from Boston, perhaps New Bedford. Separating him from the officers was a bulkhead. In the center of their accommodation is a table where he and the officers would eat. It was also used by the next group of men who were forward of the officers, but they never ever mixed with the officers and the captain. When an officer joined the vessel, he was given a dedicated whaleboat, along with 5 men. And for as long as possible, that group stayed together for the voyage. In addition, each officer had a responsibility of a 4-hour watch, 4 on, 8 off, 4 on, 8 off. They also had additional chores that they were responsible for. The chief officer took his orders from the captain and ran the vessel. He also kept the ship's logbook, and you can always tell his cabin on a ship because there is a desk in it where the logbook was kept. The second officer, second mate, probably had the responsibility of checking the sails and the running and standing equipment on board. And the third mate, the whaleboats. The next group of men that lived forward of them were divided into 2 groups. There'd be 3 or 4 harpooneers. And then there was a group known as the shipkeepers. They never actually went out in the boats. Their job when whaling was taking place was to prepare the vessel for when the whale was brought back to be processed. They were the cooper, the carpenter, the blacksmith, and the cook. Nancy will talk about the others out 2 or 3 minutes on the cook. There's a high likely he was someone that had escaped enslavement from the south by being smuggled aboard a northbound whale ship, having called into southern port, and once in northern waters, come out of hiding, presented themselves to the shipmaster, who would have turned them to work with the crew to earn his keep. There he would have learned that should he sign on to an American vessel, he would get seaman's papers. These would give him some form of citizenship and a protection against the bounty hunters that roamed the streets of New Bedford looking for such as he. His job on board, often assisted by a person, was to prepare food for the officers and the crew. Once the fresh provisions had run out, the standard fare was a stew known as lobscouse. A pot was kept going on the galley stove, and it was fed with salt meat, salted of course, along with the dried vegetables and thickened with flour or ship's biscuit. The officers lived slightly better because they had brought aboard live animals, rabbits, chickens, sometimes a goat, lamb. Of course, when they reached their expiration date, they were eaten, and the leftover bones and offals went into the lobscouse.
Okay, So by 1850, there would have been something like 25 or 30 crew members on board one of these ships, a lot of them teenagers, especially the green hands. And as Mike said, there was some employees that had nothing to do with whaling, the blacksmith, the carpenter, and the cooper for the most part. They were paid a little bit more, they ate a little bit better. I've also read that, they often looked for sea turtles, especially in the Galapagos, because you could store the sea turtles upside down. They didn't require much water and the meat was really sweet. In any case, so these guys lived in steerage. The blacksmith spent lots of time repairing tools as well as making sure that they were razor sharp. This blubber was with really blunt, sharp tools. And the agents would have put something like 150 to 200 harpoons on board a ship, as well as lances, spades, all sorts of knives. So while we're talking about the agents, very quickly, let me explain what goes on here. Sometimes if you're reading a whaling history book, you'll read about the agent and sometimes the owner agents. So the owners might have known a lot about whaling and very likely did, but they were investors. And it was one of them who was heavily invested, who was also the agent. And he was responsible for outfitting the ship. So if you purchase a ship in those days, you got the hull and 3 masts or whatever the vessel was rigged out as. And then the agent had to go and find the riggers, the sails, so forth. And then he put all the food and the tools on board ship. So if you look on the other side of your handout, you'll see a typical list of what they would have put on board ship, loads of things. Because they weren't really going to be stopping a whole heck of a lot to look for food. They would, of course, but they didn't stop as much as you would think they would, because these were floating sweatshops, right? They were out there to find whales. And so the agent could stand to make lots of money because he was charged with getting all the stuff on the ship and he was going to be getting paid for that. He was also probably one of the 8 or 10 investors, so he's got a cut there. Then I've read that he typically would guarantee the sale of the oil. So he gets a cut there. Seems like double dipping to me. But anyway, so he's got 3 different ways he's making money. He might own one of the wharves downtown and, charge for the slips and so forth, and make money that way. He might even be a merchant and supply the owners with all these various things and making a cut that way. The carpenter, of course, let me go back. So you have the agents, and then you have the outfitters. So the outfitters are just going to roam around, the greater Boston area, maybe go beyond into the middle Atlantic. They get paid $75 or $100 from the agent, and their job was to find young guys. If you were a really experienced sailor in New Bedford, you weren't going to really be caught dead on one of these whale ships. They were looking for young guys that were strong, willing, maybe didn't have too many other alternatives, and didn't know anything about what a whale ship would really be like. A lot of parents came back into New Bedford by the 1850s and hauled their kids out because they didn't want them on these whale ships and so forth. But this was the job of the outfitter. And of course, they'd sell their outfit, which was between $50 and $75, which was a lot of money in those days. And they'd get their oil skins and what they were going to eat with and their tools and so forth. But once they got on these ships, there was sort of a slop chest, they called it. And it was like a little store. So if you ran out of stuff that was in your outfit, and usually it was pretty cheap, they'd have to replace it. And they would get charged upwards of 10, 15, 20% above, the cost of those implements. So, they were in the thick of it really negatively. And then once they got back into port, there were the infitters. And those are basically land shark guys. And they try and sell them, an outfit for becoming a landlubber again, get them a haircut, get them a night in a boarding house, something like that. So everybody was standing to make money. There were regular investors, like you and I. A lot of the people who were working in sail lofts and rope walks, and it took a whole town to launch a whale ship. All those people were making money, but they also wanted to invest a little bit. So besides the large dollars that the big investors are making, you could make like an eighth, a 16th, or you could buy a 32nd or a 64th of a share. You know, and people did that as well. The carpenter, of course, repaired whale boats and anything having to do with wood on board ship. If they weren't finding whales and they were just, you know, sailing around in the ocean and there was a family on board, because very often wives went with their husbands, especially after 1850, they would make toys and cradles and things like that for the family. The cooper was a pretty important container guy. He made all the casks that carried the precious oil, and the casks had to be very well made. They didn't often really have them all made when they got on board one of these vessels. They'd carry them in kits that were numbered, and the kits were called shooks. And there'd be a collection of staves that were in the shook, and they'd be numbered. And the cooper would just put them together, you know, while they were. Let's see, what else? Crews. The crews probably knew next to nothing about whaling or sailing. They were generally trained on the way out of New Bedford. They might spear, you know, dolphins and porpoises and things like that. They again really knew very little. They had probably some trouble dealing with sailing. Many of them would be seasick and so forth. Here's a picture of our blacksmith. You can see how large these casks would get. This is where they would live in the forecastle, right at the bow of the ship. Generally, there'd be 10, 12, 15 bunks like this. Half of the guys would be up on deck and half of them would be asleep, you know, off their particular duties. They ate down here, they were sick down here, so it was really not a great place. Mike and I argue about it all the time. He thinks it would be perfectly clean and shipshape all the time. Being a captain, you know, I tend to be on the side of the cruise. I think it's probably a pretty difficult place to live. They have one little light, you know, and a Betty lamp, you know, that they would burn with oil. And all different kinds of people from around the world as well. That's why New Bedford today is so international looking. Lots of Azorians, Cape Verdeans, all based on early whaling. I love this picture of this young guy. I think he's probably a whaler. We're not really sure. But anyway, their job was to, you know, man the decks, climb the rigging, look for whales way up in the masts and so forth, and generally do whatever job was required of them.
So on leaving port, lookouts were placed on the forecastle head. Their job was to alert the officer, who would be some 100 feet astern, of the presence of anything forward of the vessel. Because of the noise, they did this by striking the ship's bell. One strike for something on the starboard side, 2 on the port, and 3 for right ahead, bringing the officer forward to take the necessary action to avoid a collision. Once on the grounds, the daytime lookout was posted 100 feet up in the air. When it got dark, the vessel would be brought head-on into the wind, bringing it to a halt until daybreak the following morning. Now, I don't know how many here of you have been 100 feet up the mast of a sailing bark with the wind behind you, rushing through the standing and running gear, and tried to have a conversation with someone down below regarding the sighting of a whale. But it is my opinion that it is next to impossible. But we do know that these lookouts were equipped with a stick with a rounded end painted as a distinctive color, in which they waved and pointed in the direction of a whale. It's known as a wigwag, but the British whaling vessels called it a yonder. The Okay.
While you're thinking about it, let me just say, Mike doesn't believe they ever said, Starship blows. We argue about that all the time.
I don't think for 1 minute that our captain was sitting in a deck chair on deck, waiting for this call. It was weeks and sometimes months between the sighting of a whale. However, during any normal weather working day, there'd be about 18 men to 20 men on deck at any one time during the daylight hours. That would include one of the two watches port of starboard, whose job was to tend to the sails, which meant that they were continually looking up and would no doubt see our man waving his wigwag that he'd sighted a whale and alert the captain. Captain came forward, and one thing he wanted to know is what sort of whale it is. He wasn't interested unless desperate on rorqual whales. Rorqual whales are whales like blue whale, humpback, gray whales. Too big, too fast, too fierce. He wanted smooth-sighted variety. Lucky for our captain, whales can identify themselves. When they come to surface, they exhale. It's warm, moist air, which mixes with the surface seawater and forms a spout. Each spout is species-specific. The sperm whale, for instance, only has one nose on top there, on its left-hand side. So it shoots a spout out, and our lookout went with his left side that spout on the sperm whale. The bowhead whale has two noses. It shoots the water straight up in the air and collapses in like a heart. That's what our lookout did. The captain knew exactly what sort of whale it was, no one had told. Captain then would go and check for himself. He wouldn't climb the mast, he would just go up the shrouds, have his spyglass, and there he would make a decision as to the number of whale boats that would be launched to go after the whale, and how many whales they were. In the meantime, they brought the vessel directly into the wind, bringing it once again to a halt. The jib sails were allowed to fill, and the vessel was swung so that the wind was directly on the starboard side, 90 degrees starboard side. This was done for a number of reasons. When the dead whale was brought back, it would only be attached by its tail to a stanchion on the forecastle head. They would first work on the head, and the wind would keep the whale alongside the vessel. Once they processed the head, it was cut free, and then they would tackle the headless body. They used the blubber hook, which was placed in a hole some 2 feet from the headless end, and an officer would start cutting what was known as a blanket piece a further 2 feet in. The blubber hook, the weight on it, was taken by the windlass. And as they pumped the windlass, the whale started to rotate. But in the meantime, normally the ship would lean over. The whale is 60 tons dead weight, almost a quarter of the weight of the vessel itself. However, because the wind was on the starboard side, they left 2 or 3 sails fully rigged on yards fore and aft. So the wind got into the sail and kept the vessel upright and allowed the blanket piece to be cut and swung on board to be processed. The whale boats that the captain had chosen were first hoisted. They sit on what are known as cranes to support them. Cranes were swung in and the whaleboats were lowered to the deck height. There, all the equipment was placed into the boat by the harpooner. It's a lot of equipment, but it said he could do it in 2 minutes. The gear is not kept in the boat. The boat, with all that weight, sitting on the cranes, the supports, would bend, would collapse. So that's the reason the white gear was kept on board until needed. With the officer in the stern and the harpooner in the bow, the boat was lowered into the water. They unhooked it, and 2 men came down each of the falls and into the boat, and off they went. Now, whales are highly intelligent animals. They have the largest brain of any creature on Earth. And they can communicate over huge distances through water. They had learned that if they swim into the wind, then anybody chasing them was going to have to row. And then whoever got tired first was the loser. So off our men went chasing the whales into the wind. There was another reason for this. In the stern of a whaleboat, underneath the thwart of the stroke oar on the starboard side, you will find a compass. Now, if it started to rain, and some of these hunts could last 4 or 5 hours, so they could very well get out of sight of the mother ship. If it started to rain, or worse still, got thick fog, they completely lost sight of not only the whales, but the mothership. Since they were going 90 degrees to the hull, all they had to do was steer the reciprocal course that the compass said, and they would find their way back to the ship. Something like 1 in 7 of these whale hunts showed some form of success. With the whale on the surface, they approached it generally by the back, by the tail. The whale's eyes are on the side of its head, so its 2 blind spots are directly ahead and directly behind. When they got relatively close to the whale on the surface, the officer in charge of the boat signaled to the harpooner to prepare. He did this by standing and placing his left thigh in a cutout in the forepart of the whaleboat, known as a clumsy cleat. On the starboard side of the bow, there's what's known as a crutch piece. It held 2 harpoons, a new one and a reconditioned one. They're tied together by 40 feet of whale line, which then stretches from the second harpoon round the bow of the boat through a part of the stem known as a choke piece, down the length of the vessel, round the stub in the stern of the vessel, known as the loggerhead, and out of one of 2 tubs, which are not joined. This vessel got close to within about 15 feet of the whale. I'm going to do this on the my legs are terrible. When they got within about 15 feet of the whale, the harpooner took his harpoon and he thrust it. It's not thrown, it's thrust. Given the opportunity, he would thrust the second harpoon into the whale. Failing, the second harpoon went over the side because it's joined to this one, and then the harpoon might take someone's head up in the woods. So he needed to get this through the blubber. If this had just landed in the blubber, it would pull straight out. he needed to get into the meat of the animal. When it got into the meat of the animal, tension is taken on the harpoon line and slightly withdraws it. As it withdraws, the toggle locks into the meat of the animal. The toggle is held in place by the small hull, and this is only a reproduction, it doesn't have the hull. But those small hull there was invented by Mr. Temple in New Bedford, and it's held in place by a wood pin, so wood pin broke and it opened up like that. Further tension on the harpoon bent this is soft iron, this would be hard iron, bent this, and the shaft would drop out. In effect, what we have now is the whale effectively hooked to the whaleboat. That's exactly what they wanted. They wanted the whale to drag the dead weight of the whaleboat and its crew, and therefore exhaust itself. Of course, the whale did not comply with this. They could dive, and they had a number of choices. The first one, of course, was to cut the line, the whale line, and there's an axe in the bow of the whaleboat to do this. Whales have been found 120, 130 years after this, after the whaling had finished, still with harpoons in them. Relatively not unknown. With the inside the whaleboat, there is a cask which they could attach to the line, which also could be used as a drag. But I think the way that was done mostly was to take the end of the line and pass it to another of the whaleboats. Eventually, of course, the whale would tire out again, so they hoped. And then the officer who would be at the stern of the whaleboat, steering, exchanged places with the harpooner. Harpooner then went aft and the mate went forward. As he walked forward on the port side, picked up a lance, placed himself in the same position as the harpooner had, placing his left thigh into the clumsy cleat, and they approached the whale.
And this is a real lance. And the harpoon would be much longer than this, you know, if they needed the length. And this is a real one. Some of them are much longer.
So they
It's okay.
they,
We killed.
so he grabbed his lance, and I want to try to imagine this. So the whale is on the surface, and in order to use the lance to kill the whale, he literally had to look into the eye of the whale. I mean, this distance away from it. It's almost unimaginable to do. He used the lance to go enter the life of the whale. What he wanted to do was cause massive internal bleeding to the whale. The whale, of course, thrashed around with its tail, and the harpooner was now at the stern of the vessel, had the job of operating with the crew, the backwater, and get clear of the whale's tail. The whale would take off in what was known as a flurry, it was a circular motion, and would hopefully expire very quickly. At which point they took a small chain or a rope, and they passed it around the tail of the animal, and they dragged it back to the mothership. If there were other whales in the area inside the whaleboat, there's a post with a flag on it known as a waif. They would put that in the animal's nose to indicate ownership, and then all the boats would get together and haul the whale back.
Okay, so we're gonna talk a little bit about trying out a whale. So that's the process of boiling the blubber, which would have been done right on board the ship. But you know, in the very early days of whaling in Nantucket and on Cape Cod and so forth, they weren't doing it this way. If they went out for a week or two, they weren't going very far. They were killing the whale out there, be on a smaller vessel, and they would cut up the whale blubber and they would put it into casks and bring it back to the beach. And they would boil the blubber right on the beach. They'd have little whaling stations and so forth. But once whalers discovered sperm whales way out, the story goes that there was a certain Captain Hussey from Nantucket who was blown off course a few hundred miles. And off in the distance, they see, as Mike was talking about, they're used to seeing North Atlantic right whales in the Northeast with two spouts going straight up. But all of a sudden they see this whale out there with one spout going at a 45-degree angle, which is a sperm whale. Nantucketers had probably seen sperm whales before they probably washed up and so forth. But they really weren't sure what kind of whale this was necessarily. They went after it. And once they discovered the really fine oil, Nantucketers just went after almost nothing but sperm whales, which meant they had to go further and further out. And also there were several reasons for going further out. They were killing off so many whales in the Northeast, you know, that they had to travel further and further along. So what would happen is, as Mike was saying, they hook the tail of the whale up to near the bow of the ship. And basically what they were going to do was use the windlass for all of this heavy operational stuff. And they would get a great big hook. If you've been to, you know, the museum and you've been to the Lagoda, you'll see a hook on board ship. That's the only thing that's not half scaled. Find a picture of it here. Yeah. So they get a hook in and they take two long lances and they get out on the trapeze that we showed you earlier and they would cut what they called a blanket piece, usually about 8 or 10 feet long. They're basically ripping it off the whale, and the whale is kind of rotating as they do this, kind of like peeling an orange, okay? So once, before they would cut that blanket piece horizontally, they'd get the hook into the next piece and keep going. This was not easy. If the weather was bad or all these chains got caught as they were turning it around, somebody would have to swim under and right everything, you know? But in any case, they would get that blanket piece cut and it would just be cut into smaller pieces. It went from a blanket piece to what they called a horse piece. And then from a horse piece, it went to a Bible leaf. And so a Bible leaf was something that was almost fillet, you know, cut in lots of thin pieces with the skin of the whale still adhered. And they'd flip that into the tri-works and boil that up. Take a couple of several hours to boil everything up in those particular copper pots that you'll see at the Whaling Museum as well. A lot of this was done right on board ship. My understanding initially was that they had these leather hoses and they would send it down below, but Mike says no, they did it right on board on the deck, you know, and then they would haul the casks down below. A lot of injuries happened this way because these casks were big. And while the ship is rolling, you know, they're not on solid land, the cask would roll up against them and break a toe or a foot, etc. They could be thrown against the hull and so forth. So you can see this is a picture of it happening. This is a drawing. Let's see if I get your real. So this is a sperm whale head being taken off. And you can see those huge chains. There are all sorts of diagrams at the museum showing how they went from step A to B to C in order to structure how the cut was going to happen. And you can see this open bit on the side of the starboard side of the ship. Here's another picture. It always slays me how these guys have straw hats on or fedoras, you know. It's so beautiful. And these guys have a border knife, and they're making the Bible leaves. See that? really heavy, dirty job. This is a sperm whale's head, spermaceti organism at the top. This was very waxy material. And the junk below, I don't know why they call it junk, because that was also very precious oil as well. This is the part of the sperm whale, they echolocate. So when they're diving for their food, they're sending out clicks that you might hear online if you go and try and find one of these simulations. They send out these vibrations from their head, and it hits an object, a boat, a rock, or, you know, their happy meal, which is a squid. And then that bounces back to their head and tells them how far away it is and what shape it is, size. And that's how they find their food. And then, this is the aftermath of the trying out. They take the smallest person on crew board and they haul them inside the head of the sperm whale. And he would ladle out all of the spermaceti because it was very viscous and, you know, already liquidy. And then they were looking for something else. Does anybody know what it is?
Oh,
Ambergris. It's really wild. Ambergris was thought to be, I guess still is, the there are some beaks on the talons of the little squid or giant squid. I'm not a biologist, I'm not sure what you would call them, we call them beaks. And if a sperm whale ingests too many of those, sometimes he gets sick, he can't get rid of it. And so some form of skin would develop around it, some tissue. It would turn into what's called ambergris. And it's been around for thousands of years. It's washed up on beaches, but it was very expensive in 1850 with something like 48 bucks an ounce. It's a lot of money, several $1,000s an ounce. If they found a lot of this ambergris, they might come home early because they can make a scat of money. There was a guy on the Cape that used to appraise it. Because there's a lot of stuff that looks like ambergris that isn't. And if you found it on the beach, you know, you might take it in to have it appraised. But it was a perfume fixative. So if you use this, you know, nowadays, if you wear cologne, you probably can tell in a few years, depending on the quality of the cologne, it turns into alcohol. You lose the scent. With ambergris, you never lose the scent. We have a bottle of French perfume from the 1880s at the museum that smells just as great as the day it was sold. It's really amazing stuff. They used to, you know, kings put it in their tea. I think they even, you know, when King Charles was anointed, they used ambergris, but he's you know, an environmental guy. So I think he decided he didn't want that happening anymore. So they got rid of the ambergris, you know, because it's ever since the Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in 1972, it's criminal to own any sort of whale parts, etc. You know, I have to carry a special letter around for taking this stuff with me. And so ambergris would be in that realm. Okay. So here's a spermaceti candle. I should probably briefly talk about this baleen over here. So besides blubber, whalemen were looking for baleen. So there are two types of whales, toothed whales or baleen whales, right? So the toothed whales are the sperm whale. You know, when I first got to the museum, I thought all whales looked like Moby Dick. I had no idea. But the toothed whales would be the orca, you know, the porpoise are in the whale family. Its cousin there, I forgot its name already. It'll come to me. But narwhals, you know, they have this long beak-like, that's considered a tooth and so forth. All the other whales, humpbacks, blue whales, they have this in their mouths. It's called baleen. This is how they filter their food. There's usually 300 or 400 plates that hang from the top of the jaw. And a lot of water goes in. These whales typically swim on the surface of the ocean. They take in a lot of water. Water goes out the sides of their mouths, and they're taking in plankton and little krill, which are tiny shrimp. and they're sucking them through, the food is sucked through the hairs. This is kind of a piece of baleen that's getting a little worn out. But do you know what they used it for? What the application was?
Corsets.
Women's corset stays. And things like brushes and Edwardian collars and buggy whips and buggy springs, umbrella ribs, anything that needed plastic, sort of a plastic approach. It was the plastic of its day because it could be steamed and then bent. It was probably making more money in the late 19th century than oil was, really, once they discovered petroleum. And they were going up into the Arctic because they go after bowhead whales, which is sort of a North Atlantic right whale. They looked alike, but they had blubber this thick, and they had baleen about 12 feet tall. Wow! So that's why they were going after the Arctic to go after that stuff. As dangerous as it was, that's a whole other presentation. See if I'm done. Just a picture of some bowhead baleen here, gentlemen. And you can see in this particular whale's head, the baleen is white. Sometimes it'll be dark. I'm not really quite sure why. Okay, Mike.
So on arriving at Buzzards Bay, the lighthouse keeper on Dumpling Rocks would recognize the vessel's house flag. Jonathan Bourne owned 8 vessels and had controlling interests in many, many more. So in his case, the captain flew signal flags. It was a pennant with 4 numbers. The lighthouse keeper read it, looked in the code book, and got the vessel's name. This is how the ships communicated at sea. Depending on which masts the flags were flown from, with or without the pennant, they could have quite a long and involved conversation. One of them might well be, do you have family on board? And another chapter with reading of flags, wife, and in which case they would get together and have what was known as a gam. Dumpling Rocks had a semaphore station and then later a telegraph station. They would notify the customs house in New Bedford, who in turn would notify the owner, who would put together a tugboat, which was a paddle wheeler, and a pilot to bring the vessel into what was a very crowded harbor. For the vessel berth, it was met by a revenue cutter. Their job was to ensure that it had achieved clearance from the last port to ensure that there was no liens against the vessel. They also inspected the crew to make sure there was no communicable diseases on board. The vessel berth starboard side alongside. And at that time, the price of oil and baleen was noted. Regardless whatever happened to the cargo, the crew would be paid upon that price. A donkey engine, steam donkey engine, was attached to the blubber hook, and the casks of oil were raised out of the hull, rolled across the deck, and onto the quay side, shore side. Now, a lot of these owners and the investors had their own refining facilities and warehouses where they could store the baleen to get better prices. If that was the case, then the teamsters would take the casks to the warehouse. However, if the oil was to go to auction or to go to a private buyer, a customs gauging agent was employed. He would check that the contents of the casks matched the description on the head of the barrel. Now came time to pay everybody. The owner and his investors had made their arrangements before the voyage was started. And as Nancy had said, it accounted for about 70% of the takings. It included a lot of the costs of the vessel, anything they could possibly associate with the vessel was added. So it came to about 70%. The crew were paid on what was known as the lay system. The lay system was based upon the sale of a barrel of oil. Now, barrel is not a cask. Barrel is a unit of measurement. It is based upon the London cask rules introduced to America about 1680. It is based upon the largest casks produced, which were used to hold wine of 262 gallons. And that is known as a ton. And each cask is a divisor of that ton.
A ton, T-U-N.
T-U-N. A barrel is 1/8, 31.5 gallons. Interestingly, of course, we're reading in papers every single day now about barrels of crude oil. Barrel of crude oil happens to be 42 gallons and is incorrectly named. 42 is a sixth of a ton, and it should be called a tiercel. But obviously, with the demise of the whaling industry and the start of the crude oil, they just transferred the title and incorrectly called it a barrel. The laces was divided into two. There was a long lay and a short lay. Short lay went through the officers down to the harpooner, and then the rest got the long lay. So captain was about a 12th share, harpooner maybe an 80th, and the crew could go from about 150th share all the way to about a 200th share.
I'm gonna talk about the whaling lines, I guess, yeah. Very good, okay. So we're running a little late, and I'm just gonna try and move through this quickly. So why did women go? This is a picture of some whaling wives, we think, but we don't know for sure. The two ladies on the right are wives of agents. Already talked about those agents. The quarters were small, lots of insects, rodents, etc. Why did women go? Voyages were very long, 3 to 4 years. I like to tell the story of Eliza Williams and her husband, Captain Tom Williams. They were from Wethersfield, Connecticut. They were of Welsh descent. After a certain number of years, they were married, young marriage, probably in their middle 20s. He had already been on a couple of voyages. She gets pregnant when he's home for about 5 or 6 months, takes off. 2 years later, he comes back and meets his first son, Henry. He stays home for another 5 or 6 months. Eliza gets pregnant again. He goes off and comes back and meets his second son, Stancil. So now he's been away for 5 years, and whatever passed for a timepiece in those days that a lady would have used, I can see Eliza looking at her watch and saying, okay, it's been 5 years now, we barely know each other. Her husband didn't really know his children very well. So she gets pregnant again, and 5 months pregnant, decides to get on a ship called the Florida with her husband. I think she takes another 7 voyages with him. She leaves her 2 little boys at home with relatives, which, would have been very difficult to do. Some wives left them home if they were school age and they were young boys. Very often they were left at home to go to school and so forth. She has 3 more children on board ship, I believe. It's either 2 or 3, and she survives 2 shipwrecks. And there's a book written about their lives together. It's called One Whaling Voyage. And it's basically, it's in your bibliography there. It's basically her journal and her grandson's whaling journal. One of her sons became a whaler. Kind of interesting. A lot of captains wanted to, make some money and then buy a beautiful farm someplace and never go whaling again. So this gentleman did that. He bought a beautiful farm, I think in Connecticut. And after a few years, he sold it and went back whaling. So very quickly, I'm just going to give you an overview of some of the real trailblazers. Caroline Mayhew from Martha's Vineyard. Her father was a physician. She knew her way around a medicine chest. They went on a couple of voyages together. They really liked the Bay of Islands, which was, off the coast of New Zealand, which was sort of a pit stop for a lot of whalers in the 1840s. She was able to minister to a number of men on board ship who got smallpox, and they were very grateful and showered her with gifts. And then her husband got it, and she was able to, with the helmsman, navigate the ship while he was ill because he couldn't get out of bed. The lady on the right, Mary Brewster, if you were going to read anybody's journal, I would read hers. It's been published. It's called Sister Sailors. Mary Brewster, see, she's got a very steely pair of eyes. She was very determined. She was from Stonington, Connecticut, and she was orphaned as a young child, and she had adoptive parents, and she wanted to go with her husband, Captain Brewster, and her parents said she'd be disowned and not welcomed back into the house if she did. And these arguments went on for a long time. She was determined, and she went, and she says, with this determination I came, low, high or low, I would try and make the best of everything, which determination I trust would be kept. I often find myself thinking of home and kind friends and acquaintances, but have no wish to be with them at present. I have chosen my own place of residence, not from the impulse of the moment, but after much calm and sober thought. And coming, my own conscience tells me I was doing right, and what do I care for the opinion of the world, or what some who have professed much friendship for me will say. So it took a lot of doing for these women to get on board these ships. Mostly what they did was nurse. And if we didn't have their perspective, a lot of them did. It was really the thing to do in the 19th century to keep a journal. A little bit different from our diary. I'm told that they expected it to be read. And if we didn't have their journals, we might not have the perspective on whaling that some of the male memoirs gave. So some of the male memoirs are really wonderful. So that they did a lot of nursing on board ship, and the men really appreciated it. Although sometimes they resented it because the wives ate really well. Now, of course, with their husbands, they ate better than crews. But I'll just read you this quick quote. Martha Smith Brown, she's from Orient, New York. Her husband dressed up in his pinstripe suit. Well, there are some men here who do not want to work, and I am lazy as any. It's been 3 weeks since I've washed, but today I have plenty of soft rain, and I have reveled. Well, these guys were not lazy in any sense of the word, not on a whale ship. They were always tasked with doing something, but they were probably out in the Pacific. No breeze, lots of hot sun. Wives would talk about, climbing on board the deck and walking around the deck and going back downstairs and reading. You'd hear about men painting cabins 3, 4, and 5 times because they didn't have enough to do. Because they, as Mike said, they often didn't find whales. And because they couldn't really wash themselves with drinking water because it was so precious, they usually would wait till it rained, and then they pumped the rain into barrels and use that to wash themselves. In this case, she's got the soft rain that she used to wash herself. This is her home in Orient, New York, still standing. And if a wife was lucky enough, she'd have this sort of a 6 by 6 foot cabin that her husband would build for her in front of the rear, the mizzen mast. She could have tea in there, spend the afternoon, look after her children if they were with her. do sewing. A lot of wives were tasked with sewing, and even if they didn't sew very well, because there was no off rack clothing, of course, in those days. But you can see that it's just sitting on a couple of concrete blocks, and if there was a really bad storm, this thing would blow right off the deck. And so their wives, the captains would ask their wives to head down into the cabins below. My last lady here, Marion Shaw Smith, she was actually a teacher at the Clark School for the Deaf. This would have been later 19th century. Women were going to school then. That particular school for the deaf is still there. She taught herself photography. A lot of the photos that you'll see on the wall in the Lagoda room at the museum were photos taken by her. She also learned how to navigate as well. Mike mentioned gamming. So gamming was sort of recreational time. If these guys were very, very good mariners and they could stop a ship and head it into the wind and have a couple of ships beside one another. And if there was another wife on board, she'd visit it. We have one of these hollowed out barrels called a gamming chair at the museum. I've read stories about some wives who thought it was ridiculous and they would get splashed anyway. So they would just climb the rope, ladders onto the next ship. This is from a movie. Down to the sea and ships. And that's our story. This is a map of the various kinds of whale populations that were found around the world. The right whales are the blue color, the sperm whales are the red color. You'll see along here, if you read any books, they'll talk about sailing down the line, going up and down the line. That's the equator. So as Mike was explaining to me, the equatorial currents on either side of it, the northern equatorial current and the southern would all meet here. So it was very turbulent, and they could get, the whales could find a lot of fish to eat there and so forth. And a lot of whalers would hang out there for that purpose. Yeah, so I don't want to hold you guys any longer. Thank you very much. If you have any questions.
So have you got any questions that you can, yes, ma'am?
Well, I had a question about the harpooner. I'm picturing him as maybe like the quarterback. I mean, did they have special training in order to do that and practice?
No. They, what they would do is, anybody on board the vessel, the crew, that were interested, they make friends with the harpooner. And what they would do, they would practice by harpooning dolphin porpoise. And that's how they learned. Just out of practice. There was no other form of training.
In the early days, the boat steerer in the back was often a mate or a captain, So they had the most experience, and it was a business, right? So they had to make certain they brought some whales back,
But the harpooner did sign up as at that rank. On the ship's papers, it was as harpooner.
You made a little more money as a harpooner or a boat steerer. Any other questions? Yes.
Making the oil, is that from heating the blubber?
Right, so when it came back to a factory, it's a long involved process, but they would take the oil and boil out the extra water first. And then they'd store it. And in the days before using energy, they would wait for it to become congealed. Sometimes bury it in the earth or keep it cold. And a few months later, you would get kind of like olive oil, you get a winter, a spring, and a summer pressing. And so once it was congealed, they'd use these great big screw presses to press it. They would have these congealed pieces of whale blubber in canvas cloth, small canvas cloth. You see old pictures in factories, all the, the canvas bags are stored like this. And the first pressing gives you the best oil. And then they store the rest of that, what's left over. And then you get a second pressing, which gives you second best oil. And then the third summer pressing, which gives you the least best. And what was left at the very end was processed in a particular way to make the spermaceti candles. There was bleaching involved and the use of various chemicals.
You're wondering who figured this out, in the beginning. Well, let's make whale oil,
Nantucketers, mostly.
Must be pretty desperate.
And people on the Cape. Well, I mean, how are you gonna find oil to lubricate machinery or burn a candle? I mean, they were using pig lard and so forth, hog's lard to make candles. It was cheaper. A lot of people didn't really walk around with spermaceti candles in their cupboards at home. They were very expensive. That was a big money maker initially. There was this whole, spermaceti trust in New Bedford, and they were trying to control the prices and so forth. But yeah, it was, I mean, when washed up on the beaches, they used the whole animal, except I think for the meat in this country.
Probably
Anyway.
how it started.
The parson would get a certain amount and the rest of it would go to the villagers,
Of all the different countries, was America into whaling more than any other country?
There was a lot.
Well, they might have been the last to do it, but I mean, were percentage wise, were they doing it more than any other country or less or?
Yes, the one thing that in favor here was the tri-works. They really came up with that concept. The tri-works in other countries was done ashore. They would process the blubber ashore. But here they decided, because of vessels having to travel further and further from shore, that they would put the tri-works on board the vessel. So here came with the first people to do that.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it's the Bats were told who were the first whalers. And when they started running out of whales in the Bay of Biscay and so forth, they started heading up to the Davis Straits in the Arctic. And then the Brits and the Dutch, everybody wanted to get in on the act, which they did do. So the British were whaling before us. But it was those Quakers, it was just this group of individuals. They didn't have any other way of moving an economy on the island, and that was how they did it.
But the Inupiat and the Inuit populations have been hunting whales for their meat and for their oil for thousands of years. So
That makes sense.
I always like to think that our friends, when they came over to start, the Plymouth people came over, that the sailors on board could very well have been on a whale ship. I mean, it's one of the first Indians that spoke English, like. And he got it from somewhere up in Canada where British whaling vessels had been. So it's a very interesting subject, but we were long behind it. I think one of these sailors on board the Mayflowers, as they were coming into Plymouth Bay, saw whales, but went back and told his mates when he got back home, hey, it's worth coming over here and do some whaling. We don't have to go up to cold Canada. So,
Thank you.
probably.
Questions? Yes. We answered it, maybe. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm curious that any of the journals that were kept, did any of them speak to the survival rate of children on these long voyages?
Well, it's researching the children's a little bit difficult. But the survival rate of whalers themselves, we know a little bit about. And Mike and I have done a little bit of research. It seems to agree with the museum that there was about a 5% loss of all whale ships. Most of the dying happened, you know, during the whale hunt, sometimes just falling from the rigging. But actually, the greatest losses were men just canceling out. They were either deserting, they were causing mutinies, or they were leaving after about a year. Because they just couldn't, you know, it just wasn't tenable for them. Food was so awful and they weren't getting paid well. And, you know, talking earlier about this company that was formed, every time a new voyage happened, it was a new company. There goes your CEO, the captain, with your ship and all that money and everything, and you had to really rely on your captain. And sometimes these captains, like anybody else, they went off the rails. And so they would get really nasty on board ship. And so it's really interesting to read, I find, about the consuls around the islands, around the world, because it was their job to arbitrate these disagreements. You know, for example, a whaling voyage didn't end until the ship got into New Bedford or wherever. So if the ship got filled, they would just ship a lot of it home, either by railroad or by another ship. And then, you know, if he was having luck, the captain would just keep whaling. And some crews got very tired of this. And so they would make a complaint once they got into an island. The consul would have to arbitrate, you know, usually the captain won out, you know, most of the time. So forth. So it's really interesting learning about what the crews would take and what they couldn't take after a while. You know, flogging was canceled out. It was considered illegal after 1850 sometime. There were some court cases in Boston for New Bedford, you know, where captains were taken to task for some of the things they did.
But that sort of punishment was rare because the most valuable asset on any ship is your crew. If you damage the crew, you can't proceed with the voyage. So
Unless you were crazy.
you have to,
Oh, sorry. Couldn't help myself. Did everybody fill out one of these little forms for a free ticket to the museum? No.